Hey everyone, we sent Hector to just smurf as a jungler in low ELO. Besides a single game, he admits he played poorly. Looking at these results, it's fair to say he's consistently stomping games at Platinum MMR, much like any other Challenger jungler would. But Hector is different to most Challenger junglers, which is good news for us mortals. In last week's Challenger earpiece, we had Japanese import explaining pathing based on counting CS and perfect awareness of where the enemy jungler was at all times. These are things that are great to work on and you should be striving to perfect. That being said, you can hard carry games not pressing F keys every 3 seconds and instead just follow some very basic guidelines that are immediately applicable. Thus, here's Hector's top 5 tips for jungling in Platinum ELO and below. There's just one small disclaimer, these tips may not all be correct from an analytical standpoint. We're recommending them specifically for low ELO because it's less about playing optimal League of Legends and more about punishing how many mistakes are made in these ELO brackets. With that in mind, let's get into it. Our initial tip is to not force plays. This mindset is best understood when comparing professional players to the average player. Pros are people who play the game 12 to 14 hours a day and have tons of staff constantly giving them guidance on how to play, build, stats, etc., etc. Now, if you don't watch pro play, that's fine, but you should know that they are constantly critiqued for their play. They make so many mistakes every single game, even when it's their job to be good at it. Let's compare that to who you're up against when you queue up. You're likely versus people who, on average, play around 1 game per day for fun. The point here is that if the people who dedicate their lives to this game constantly make mistakes, then players who don't take it nearly as seriously or play as often are going to make an absurd amount of mistakes. We're not trying to flame pros or average players. The point is that it's really hard not to make mistakes in this game. Most of the time, you don't really need to do anything fancy to pick up kills in the lower ELO brackets. People are basically asking to get killed by you. All you've got to do is pick up these freebies whenever you see them. What you don't want to do is to overly commit to plays that you aren't certain will work. We very often see players just overly trying to force ganks, wasting a ton of time. There really is no guarantee that a gank setup will work, no matter how long you wait, so you should avoid situations like this entirely. Generally, just farming and waiting for really free opportunities to present themselves is going to be the correct approach when looking for ganks. The same goes for objectives. In this Vi game, the enemy team is really overextending to crack the mid-tier 2 tower, and Hector and his team easily collapse on them, scoring 2 kills. Naturally, they begin forcing Baron, and Hector pings his smite being down. Instead of using Baron as a bait to wipe the enemy team, his teammates rush to finish the Baron so that Evelynn can easily steal. Sometimes you can forget this lesson and you have to relearn it the hard way. You never want to force objectives unless you know it's going to be a clean take. There should be no reason to ever take any risk, however small it may be in low ELO, simply because there's no need to. The appropriate play is usually just to wait for the enemy to willingly fling themselves at you rather than try and force something proactive yourself. Of course, this tip is primarily if your goal is simply to win. We would never recommend not taking at least some occasions to limit test and work on your mechanics. Ideally, you play the early game rather reserved and get a lead, and afterwards you can start doing crazy limit testing shenanigans once you know you've got the game in the bag. Our next tip is don't stop moving and farming. One of the major issues we notice from players is how often they just sit around and, well, not really get much done. Jungle is a pretty intense role. Every other lane has a kind of a limit as to what they can do, right? Laners generally just sit in lane and farm waves and trade a bit. But as a jungler, you have so much freedom and there's almost always so much for you to do, which is why this tip is important. These next few examples of what we mean by this won't seem too meaningful, but we'll explain why towards the end. Notice this fight going in on mid that Hector is approaching. The second it's clear nothing is occurring anymore, he immediately walks away to farm. Or here, he's being chased super hard by Bard and Aurelia. He queues away and doesn't hesitate to keep farming whatever he can. He picks up raptors and a red buff. And as he's crossing mid, Evelynn sticks her charm on him. There's almost zero hesitation before he's like, okay, nothing is happening, bye-bye, as he keeps trucking along. Another example is this Graves game. He walks in trying to get a kill on Amumu, and when it doesn't happen, he immediately gets right back to farming the enemy raptors. These small actions may seem insignificant, he's just going back to farming, right? The point is that there is no hesitation as he does so. Let's imagine in this Graves clip, for example, that Graves is a low elo jungler. After ulting Amumu, he might question himself like, I wonder if we can siege here now. Then he'd wait for his team to push the wave, the enemy would come defend, and only then would Graves realize, oh, I can't do anything here, and he'd go farm the Raptor camp. By the time it takes a low elo Graves to maybe come to that conclusion, a good jungler would already have taken both Raptors and Krugs and be setting up a dive in top lane. Sure, this entire dive is super sketchy and barely wins the Zed duel in the end, but the point stands. Challenger junglers feel like they're everywhere whenever smurfing because they just don't hesitate on anything. Even if your play is incorrect, you will usually be rewarded because you're just everywhere faster than your opponent. Lastly, based on this tip, you should be making your macro decisions as you're moving from place to place. So in that Graves example, maybe it was possible to siege mid, but you shouldn't ask yourself that as you stand still waiting for the wave. Ask yourself about macro decisions as you farm nearby camps. There's only one very specific circumstance in which you don't want to constantly be moving, and that is to sit there and prevent the enemy Kayn from taking the scuttle crab. Take your sweet time, take a full minute if you need to. This is the most important fight of the game and you better win it. And when it's your team that comes first to help you secure that crab, there is literally no greater bliss on this planet than the mental victory you just got over that Kayn. In all seriousness, this was one of those situations where it was fine to not keep moving. Hector full cleared all his camps, whereas Kayn only did 4, including his 2 buffs. Wasting time is allowing his own camps to respawn, whereas Kayn is only getting 2 respawned camps. We mostly included this for how ridiculous a situation it was, but also that yes, you should sometimes sit in an area and contest something, but there should be some form of reward from it. Don't just sit in an area for no reason staring at your opponent. Before our next tip, we do quickly want to mention our hyper improvement platform, Skill-Capped. It holds the largest premium guide catalog out there for League of Legends by far, like it's not even close. We now have over 1,100 guides you can start watching right away, just like the ones you see here on YouTube. With Challenger-tailored courses for every skill, full-length Smurf commentaries where you can ask our challengers anything, and direct pro coaching, Skill-Capped is clearly the place to be to actually start climbing. If you don't improve while actively using Skill-Capped, you can claim a refund. So check us out after this. On to our next tip, which is to avoid grouping at all costs. Grouping is absolutely one of the worst things you can do when climbing. It sounds wrong, but this is a concept best understood when using larger numbers. Let's imagine you're in some medieval era and there's a battle. Both sides have 10,000 men and are about to brawl. Let's say you're a pikeman in this conflict. Do you think your personal skill with the pike would mean absolutely anything to the eventual outcome of the fight? Of course not. The numbers are too large, thus individual skill is almost negligible. The battle would be decided by the generals or whatever. This concept directly translates over to League. You want to avoid grouping because in duels or small skirmishes, your individual skills matter much more since there's less variables to affect the outcome. Therefore, you generally want to be alone, particularly in a side lane looking to pick players off. Jungle as a role is already relatively weak in teamfights based on the champion pool of available junglers. A jungle champion could likely never match the utility and damage that a Vel'Koz per se would bring to a fight. But junglers are typically fairly mobile and excel in these skirmish-type engagements. So there's double the reason to avoid grouping. 1, there's too many variables in teamfights for you to have consistent results. And 2, jungle champions excel at this playstyle anyways. There's the immediate concern a lot of you may have though. What if you're primarily a tank player? It wouldn't be at all possible to do this since their main strength is team fighting. Not necessarily true. If you're super fed as a tank, then you can obviously 1v1 players rather easily. It's not an outlandish concept that a tank can 1v1 people, especially when they're ahead. Clearly that's the ideal though, and not going to happen every game. As a tank jungler, your usual goal in a game should be helping your own side laners score kills with your CC. Making sure you get sweeper and running around setting your teammates up to make picks is the best way to play a tank in low elo solo queue. But there are of course games where these options won't be possible. That's fine, sometimes you will have to teamfight. This Amumu game in particular was super rough. It's hard for an Amumu to set up picks onto a Vladimir or Maokai in a side lane, so oftentimes Hector was forced to teamfight. It's also a great game to showcase why we advocate so heavily against team fighting. Hector, a challenger player, is struggling to win these team fights as an Amumu. Almost every fight this game was super close, and it could have gone either way. Like we said, there's only so much individual skill will matter, especially when you're playing a tank. Our fourth tip is that movement speed and sustain are some of the best stats you can go for when playing in these ELO brackets. One of the major reasons that these stats hold more value in low ELO is that your opponents are far from playing optimally like we mentioned earlier. You don't need to follow conventional power spikes when your opponent likely can't punish you for not doing so. This opens up options in rune paths and itemization that allows your carry potential to be much higher than it normally would. First, let's start with movement speed. As we discussed, players are actively looking to die by the way that they play. Movement speed allows you to go from one area of the map to another to punish these blatant mistakes much quicker so that you don't miss the opportunity to clean up some kills. Not only that, but the small dip in power you'll be suffering from investing in movement speed is generally made up for by how much faster you earn gold than your opponent. With side lanes completely vacant in low ELO, oftentimes there's no limit to how many resources you can farm. The only thing stopping you from acquiring all this gold is how fast you can move around the map. So even though investing in movement speed may cause you to be momentarily weaker, it shouldn't matter, since if you're playing well, you can easily make up that quickly. Sustain is going to go along the same vein as movement speed. There's so many free kills and farm to acquire in low ELO that having to base while something is present would be a complete waste. Being able to regenerate your health without basing is incredibly useful in this ELO, where you're able to farm more side waves than usual and more enemy jungle camps are left up. Basically, you're out on the map longer and you can punish the dumb stuff people are doing, like this Amumu dying in a side lane instead of trying to farm and catch up. Keep in mind that not every champion can optimize these two stats efficiently every game. That being said, here's the most common way you can get movement speed and sustain on the three types of junglers. For AD-based junglers, they generally have it pretty easy. You already get lifesteal from your jungle item. You don't need to prioritize picking up any extra sustain. As for movement speed, you can pick up Relentless Hunter in the domination tree on most AD champions to run around really quickly once you have kills. As for sustain on AP champions, all of them except Elise and Evelynn run Ravenous Hunter, so that's immediately fixed for you. They don't need to, since their kits have built-in sustain already. AP junglers' movement speed items should almost always be Magi Soul Stealer. You should be picking up Dark Seal around your first base and then upgrading it after you finish your jungling item. We also don't want to hear that we're just recommending this item because we expect you to hard smurf every game. Competitive players are starting to constantly buy it in their games. It's not in any way a disrespectful item, it's just the easiest and most convenient way of getting movement speed on AP champions, and it's even easier to get stacks in low ELO due to how frequent kills are available. Finally, we have tank junglers. For the tank junglers that can get sustain in some way through their runes or just their kit, then you rush Deadman's Plate as your second item for Cinderhulk. For Sejuani, run Relentless Hunter. Yes, this isn't optimal in high ELO, but in low ELO, it's better for running around and killing people. Then after Cinderhulk, rush Warmogs. And then there's Rammus. He's just such a cheesy champion. He already has good movement speed ability, but there's no way of building sustain on him without hurting what he's good at. Just do your usual Thornmail builds. As a final note on items, you should use your head when deciding whether to spend gold on some of these stats. For example, in the Amumu game, Hector was against Maokai, Vladimir, Swain, and Taric. That's an absurd amount of healing and magic damage. Although he went a weird Fleet Footwork and Ravenous Hunter build for sustain, he did not opt into Deadman's Plate for movement speed. He desperately needed healing reduction and magic resistance to deal with the enemy composition. So if they have something absurd like Yone, Yasuo, and Caitlyn, then obviously it's fine to forego these stats and build something like Randuin's Omen instead, which would fit the game better. With those builds in mind, we go to our final tip, which is don't share gold. For this, we must keep in mind how gold scales in League. We've said this before, but basically funneled gold onto one person is more useful than spread out gold over multiple people. Items scale with each other, so less gold onto one person technically can have higher impact than more gold spread out over more players. This means that you don't ever want to be in a position where you are sharing gold with your teammates. Tower plates and tower kills are the only ways in which gold is directly shared within the game. This tip is really simple to understand. Basically, you just want to avoid pushing towers with your teammates most of the time. For example, after this top lane gank, Hector wastes no time here to share turret plates. Let's say they got 2 tower plates in this situation. That'd be 160 gold on each of them, which is around the value of a single camp. Not only that, but obviously plates don't give you experience. The ideal play is to give your teammates the solo gold while you go farm something else. This puts more money in their pockets while you're getting just as much, if not more gold, by just continuing to farm. As a jungler, this directly impacts your Rift Herald usage. When you take the objective, you almost never want to use it immediately. You want to wait for your teammates to leave lane so that you can cash in on all the turret plates yourself. Sometimes it happens magically where you score 2 kills and your teammate luckily dies during the process. Right after these 2 kills, Hector had 1300 gold, and after taking both towers within the span of 35 seconds, he gained 1600 gold. Solo turret gold really is super effective as snowballing someone ahead. Realistically though, it happens like this way more often. Your teammate roams for whatever reason, and that's going to be your chance. Go into their lane, push in the wave, and use Herald for 2 to 3 turret plates. This will usually give you around 600 gold instantly, combined with the wave you took, and it's the most consistent way of using Herald in low elo to snowball yourself. Alright guys, remember that guides like this are just the tip of the iceberg. If you want to start rapidly improving at League of Legends within, then be sure to join our like-minded community at Skill-Capped. Thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the next video.